Let me give you a name. Simeon Powers. Do you know that name, Simeon Powers? Does that name ring a bell? Do you know who that is? I'll tell you who Simeon is in just a minute, but I wonder if he ever asked himself if what he was doing mattered. Like, if the task that God had given him to do, were they going to make a lasting difference? What about Palmer Cross? Do you know that name? Or maybe Peter Freeman? Do you know any of those names? I wonder if they ever asked those same questions. What about you? Do you ever wonder if what you do, does it matter? Is it making a difference? Will anybody remember you? I asked those questions. We're wrapping up the book of Numbers, this series. This is the 8th week that we've been in the book of Numbers. And what I want to do to close it out is kind of look at 3 snapshots, 3 just moments in time that are going to wrap up this book. And certainly, though, this series could go on quite a bit longer. There's actually 36 chapters in the book of Numbers. We're only through the first 24. And if you read through the rest of the chapters of Numbers, you'd see it's a lot of the same things we've been looking at. Some battles, some disobedience, some traveling, worshiping idols. There's another census that takes place. But what I want to do in this last week in Numbers together is dial in on 3 moments in time that bring this to a close. Now, of the 3 that we're going to look at, only one actually happens in the book of Numbers, but these snapshots as a whole will most likely serve as a transition into a future sermon series. You'll see what I mean when we get to the end. Now, thus far, the book of Numbers, there's kind of 3 key characters, if I can call them that. There's God, there's Israel, and then there's Moses. Those are kind of the 3. Sure, there's some supporting characters along the way, but those are 3 of the main ones. We're about to be reintroduced, though, to someone that we've met before who moves from a supporting role to one of the main characters. Here's snapshot number 1, passing the baton. All right, let's read together now Numbers chapter 27. I'm going to pick it up in verse 12. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Go up this mountain of the Abarim range and see the land that I have given the Israelites. After you have seen it, you will also be gathered to your people as Aaron your brother was. When the community quarreled in the wilderness of Zin, both of you rebelled against my command to demonstrate my holiness in their sight at the waters. So Moses appealed to the Lord. May the Lord, the God who gives breath to all, appoint a man over the community who will go out before them and come back in before them, and who will bring them out and bring them in, so that the Lord's community won't be like sheep without a shepherd." Moses has been around for a long time, and he's nearing the end of his life. And God tells him to go up to the top of this mountain and take a look at the promised land. And then he says this kind of odd phrase, "You will also be gathered to your people as Aaron your brother was." In other words, what that means is that God is telling Moses, it's about time that you're going to die. And Moses, even in the very end, as is true to his form, he's not worried about himself. He doesn't plead with God to change his mind about entering the promised land. Remember, we studied that a few weeks ago when Moses struck the rock in a way that God didn't want him to. Moses isn't bitter towards the people. He's got one thing on his mind, one thing that he's thinking about. Who's going to take care of them after I'm gone? Who's going to take care of the Israelites? These people, they need a leader. These sheep, they need a shepherd. So here's what God says, verse 18. The Lord replied to Moses, "Well, take Joshua, son of Nun, a man who has the Spirit in him, and lay your hands on him. Have him stand before the priest Eleazar and the whole community, and commission him in their sight. Confer some of your authority on him, so that the entire Israelite community will obey him. He will stand before the priest Eleazar, who will consult the Lord for him with the decision of the Urim. He and all the Israelites with him, even the entire community, will go out and come back in at his command." Moses did as the Lord commanded him. He took Joshua, had him stand before the priest Eleazar and the entire community. Moses says the sheep need a shepherd, and God says, "Give me Joshua." So that's what Moses does. They have a ceremony before the entire nation so that everybody knows this is the guy now. The baton is being passed. Now, we've met Joshua before in the book of Numbers. Where did we see him? Well, remember the 12 spies? The 10 were bad and 2 were good, where we did our song. Joshua was one of the 12 spies. He was one of the 2 good ones. He's mentioned there as saying to the people, listen, we can take this land. God's given it to us. And because of his faithfulness, his obedience to the Lord, God promises that Joshua will enter the promised land. Here's where that happens. We read this when we covered it, but this was Numbers chapter 14, verse 30. I swear that none of you will enter the land I promised to settle you in, except Caleb, son of Jephunneh, and Joshua, son of Nun. You see, Joshua's been establishing a track record as a leader, right? He's one of the 12. He was somebody that people knew. He was respected. He demonstrated that he was willing to go against the mob mentality if it was the right thing to do. So God gives Joshua the authority that he needs in order to lead. And the baton has now been passed. This is not an all-inclusive list, but we kind of start with Abraham and then Isaac and Jacob, and you maybe put Joseph in there, and then Moses, and now Joshua. Which brings us to snapshot number 2, the death of Moses. It feels like we've gotten to know Moses a little bit in this series, doesn't it? At least for me. We've seen his heart for the people that God's given him to lead. We've seen Moses' strength in the face of adversity. We've seen his passion when he's pleaded with the Israelites to do the right thing. We've seen his frustration. We've seen his broken spirit when he's interceded to God on the Israelites' behalf. And now we see a final promise fulfilled and his remarkable life come to an end. Here's what we read now in Deuteronomy 34. Then Moses went up from the plains of Moab to Mount Nebo. He's on the journey now that God told him to take. And the Lord showed him all of the land. And the Lord then said to him, "This is the land I promised Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I will give it to your descendants. I have let you see it with your own eyes, but you will not cross into it." Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab, according to the Lord's word. He buried him in the valley in the land of Moab, facing Beth Peor, and no one to this day knows where his grave is. Moses was 120 years old when he died. His eyes were not weak, and his vitality had not left him. The Israelites wept for Moses in the plains of Moab 30 days. Then the days of weeping and mourning for Moses came to an end. God does what he promised to do. This feels like such an honored moment for Moses, that here in his final moments on earth, he has this personal interaction with the Lord. Right? We read, the Lord showed him all of the land. It feels almost like a personal tour from the mountaintop. The Lord says, I have let you see it with your own eyes. And even in verse 6, it says that the Lord himself buried Moses in a place that no one would know. And then this chapter, this book, ends with a tribute to Moses. We didn't read it, but it's at the end of chapter 34 that just signals the highest honor for God's faithful servant. And yet there's this one detail in verse 7 that I think we need to take note of. It says that Moses was 120 years old when he died. It says his eyes were not weak and his vitality had not left him. In other words, Moses didn't die just because he was old. He had completed his assignment that God gave him to do. That's really the reason. The promised land, finally, was drawing near. And it's made clear to us that Moses didn't enter the promised land because he died, but instead he died because he couldn't enter the promised land. Which now brings us to the final snapshot. Joshua takes charge. So put yourself in Joshua's shoes here for a minute. What is he feeling? He's approximately 80 years old. He's been through a lot. He's seen a lot. He knows that God fulfills his promises. He knows that God has granted him authority and marked him as Israel's next leader. But still, to take the place of Moses, he's got big shoes to fill. And here's how the story continues. Now we're in the book of Joshua, chapter 1, verse 1. After the death of Moses, the Lord's servant, the Lord spoke to Joshua, the son of Nun, Moses' assistant. Moses, my servant, is dead. Now you and all the people prepare to cross over the Jordan to the land I am giving the Israelites. I have given you every place where the sole of your foot treads, just as I promised Moses. No one will be able to stand against you as long as you live. I will be with you, just as I was with Moses. I will not leave you or abandon you. Be strong and courageous, for you will distribute the land I swore to their ancestors to give them as an inheritance. Haven't I commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or discouraged, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. So, what must Joshua be feeling? I'm going to put two words on it here. Cautious, but confident. Right? Cautious because God's telling him, don't be afraid. Don't be discouraged. Don't be intimidated by the things that you can see. I know that you can see those obstacles that are out there in front of you, but don't be scared. Be confident. Because God reminds him and tells him, I am with you wherever you go. Remember my promises. Remember what you saw me do for your leader, Moses. Remember the lessons that I taught him. I will always do what I say I am going to do. And if I tell you I'm giving you this land, I am giving you this land. And I love the way the next section starts. You know, it's kind of like we're watching the end of a movie that's kind of setting up for a part two. Maybe you've seen a movie like that, right? The fearless leader, throughout the first movie, everything comes to a close. And the fearless leader, he's died, but there's still more work to be done. The battle isn't over yet. And so the heir has been chosen. He's unsure of the future. How am I ever going to take over for that leader? And he kind of gets this pep talk. And so the new leader kind of squares his shoulders, takes a deep breath, and gets to work. Here's the next verse 10 of Joshua 1. Then Joshua, this is after hearing God tell him, be strong and courageous. Then Joshua commanded the officers of the people, go through the camp and tell the people, get provisions ready for yourselves. For within 3 days you will be crossing the Jordan to go in and take possession of the land the Lord your God is giving you to inherit. Finally, the promised land is here. In the following chapters, we would read about Joshua and his leadership as he led the Israelites across the Jordan River and into the promised land through victories in battle. And we read how God continues to fulfill his promises, and he does what he says he will do. And just like that, in those three snapshots, we move from one leader to the next. And maybe that'll be an upcoming sermon series looking at the life of Joshua. Yeah, though we didn't cover every story in the book of Numbers, I think you got a fairly good look at what's in it, right? What's it about? Remember how we started asking, like, if you would pick a book like Numbers off the shelf? Right, with that title, Numbers. Who wants to read a book called Numbers? Who would do that? Well, you might have seen how it's titled, Numbers. Doesn't quite do the book justice, does it? There's quite a lot that's going on in this book. Plagues, poor decisions, manna, losses in battle, spies, a talking donkey, victory, death. We learned about Moses, what a remarkable man of faith that he was, a spiritual giant. We saw many times over how so many elements of this book point to Jesus Christ and what happens at the cross of Calvary. But as I was wrapping up my study of this book, I was struck by a question. I thought a lot about this question. In fact, I thought I would ask it to you. Which leader is more important? The one who led them to the promised land, or the one who's actually going to lead them into the promised land? In fact, if you could broaden the question just a little bit, like when you look at Israel's history, who was the most important figure? Was it Moses? Is it going to be Joshua? Maybe you'd say, well, no, it's neither of those. It's Abraham. Or maybe you'd say it's Joseph. Maybe David. What about Esther or Ruth? Maybe you'd even argue for Jeremiah. And you're saying, okay, Joel, you're just listing books of the Bible at this point. But when you look at that list of people, what's both remarkable and unremarkable at the same time? What's both fascinating yet fairly plain about that list of people? All they did was what God asked them to do. Each of them, they just tried to live lives of faith, trusting in God, doing the tasks that He put before them. Quite simply, those people, they were deployed. In fact, I think if you were to somehow ask them which one of them was the most important, they would be shocked that I was even asking that question. Why? Because this whole thing is God's story. It's not theirs. All they did were the tasks that they had been given to do. Panama Baptist Church, you are deployed. Right now, if you've been with us on our online service or at the in-person, you know that we often end our time together on the videos or on Sunday mornings by ending with that statement, Panama Baptist Church, you are deployed. We talk about deployment here an awful lot. Now, if you're new with us, or maybe you've heard us say that and you're not quite sure what it means, you just thought we really liked the military. When we say we're deployed, we are reminding one another that the battles don't happen within the church walls, right? They happen out there, at your work, in your family, with your neighbors, at the grocery store, at your school, at the coffee shop. It's a reminder that the church isn't a cruise ship or even a battleship. It's an aircraft carrier. You come here on Sundays, you get refilled, get your marching orders, if you will, you restock on supplies, and then you head back out. Can you imagine what it would have been like if Moses didn't live deployed? If Moses just went to the tabernacle, right? Like that was his church. Now I know it's not exactly the same comparison, but just bear with me for this analogy. If Moses went to the tabernacle on Sundays, but then he didn't live out his faith the rest of the week, he just left it to someone else. Or Joshua said, no, that's not for me. Find someone else. Here's the thing. We look at people like that, heroes of the faith, and we think, I could never do that. I could never be Moses. I could never live up to what Joshua was going to do. And we put this pressure on ourselves to live up to certain expectations, or maybe we lose motivation because we think what we're doing isn't important enough, or that it's probably not going to matter. But take a look at what it says in Ephesians chapter 2, verse 10. For we are His workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared ahead of time for us to do. This one verse, it takes all of the pressure off, right? Look at it. It tells you who you belong to. It tells you your purpose, and it tells you your plan. First, God created you as a good work. The word workmanship there, it means literally a work of art or a masterpiece. See, God, when He made you, He did not make a piece of junk. He doesn't do that. He didn't do a rush job on you. He did not leave you lacking. He lovingly formed you. Psalm says that you are fearfully and wonderfully made, and you are perfectly equipped. And I don't mean that in a trite way, right? Like sometimes you might say to somebody in your family, you're perfectly capable of waiting a half an hour for dinner, something like that. No, you are perfectly equipped to do exactly what God called you to do. And that's the second thing that Ephesians 2:10 tells us. God called you to good works. God did not create you as His masterpiece to sit on the sidelines. God did not create you to just gather dust. God created you for a very specific purpose, good works. And think about it. God is not going to create something for a certain purpose and then not build it and design it in the way it needs in order to accomplish the task. And speaking of those tasks, God curated your good works. When I worked at Lifeway, I've mentioned that before, Lifeway ended up closing all of their stores, and kind of the final thing, well, not the final thing, but one of the final things that I think kind of did us in is we went to this idea of curation. Now, I don't know if you've ever been in a bookstore, but you go in and they just have, of course, books everywhere. And so we had different sections of books. You know, there was a section on Christian living, there was a section for men, a section for women, marriages, parenting, etc. And you would go in and there would just be all sorts of titles. And it could be easy, if you didn't know exactly what you were looking for, or you didn't have some good help, it could be easy to get lost in all of the titles. And so what Lifeway decided to do was to curate the titles. And so instead of going into the section on parenting, for example, and there just being rows and rows of books for you to look through, they would take like the top 20 books on parenting, and they got rid of everything else and just here's 20 books on parenting, or here's the top 20 devotionals, or whatever it might be. Turns out that's not what most people are wanting in a bookstore. They're wanting to come in and just be able to browse all of the titles. And so for a bookstore, this was, in my opinion, not a very good idea. But for the Christian life, well, this might just actually be the best part. See, God has intentionally laid out the path that I'm supposed to walk. God has laid out the good works. He has prepared ahead of time these works for us to do. In fact, the phrase "for us to do" could also be translated as "in order that we might walk in them." Feeling like you'll never live up to Moses? That you're never going to be able to fill the shoes of Joshua? Good. Because God doesn't want you to. What He wants you to do is to walk each day by faith, just doing the things that He has put in front of you to do. Intentionally walking that path, remembering what you were created to do, remembering what your calling is, and remembering your curated selection of good works that God has prepared for you. Take Eleazar, for example. Did you miss Eleazar in the story that we read a moment ago? Jump back to Numbers 27. This was in the first snapshot. The Lord replied to Moses, "Take Joshua, have him stand before the priest Eleazar and the whole community, and commission him in their sight." Moses did as the Lord commanded him. He took Joshua and had him stand before the priest Eleazar, and he laid his hands on him and commissioned him, as the Lord had spoken through Moses. Did Eleazar miss out because he didn't do what Moses did? Was he less than because he wasn't called on to be the next leader like Joshua was? Of course not. Why not? Because it is not what God had for him to do. God didn't call him to be Moses, to do what Moses did. God called him to be a priest, serving faithfully each day, just doing what he was equipped and created to do, the good works that were prepared and selected for him beforehand, until that one day when God tapped Eleazar on the shoulder and said, "I need you to do something for me." See, the world tells us that we find success in the size of our accomplishments, the size of our career, our bank account, our fame, how many people know who we are. But I'm here to tell you, friend, that we find lasting, eternal success in whether or not we simply did what God asked us to do. Why? Because it's God's story, not ours. Now, some of you might be called to lead. And some of you might be called to be a missionary. Some of you might be called to be a pastor. In fact, that is who Simeon Powers was, a pastor. That name that I gave you at the very beginning, he, in fact, was the first pastor of what's now called Panama Baptist Church. He became that first pastor back in 1817. And the other two names, Palmer Cross and Peter Freeman, they were pastors too. They were the second and third pastors of this church. And though you probably didn't recognize their names, you still feel the impact of their ministry. You feel the truth that what they did even though they might have been wondering in the moment, what they did mattered, because God had prepared for them a path of good works that would start a church here and continue it and sustain it on for over 200 years. And though you didn't know their names, they'd be just fine with that, because this is God's story, not theirs. And because this is God's story, and He's the one who creates and calls and curates, the most important thing then that I could be doing with my life is what He's given me to do. He's the one that determines the assignments. And so equally important to the leaders, the pastors, the missionaries, are the ones that seek to be deployed by simply showing Christ's love to their neighbors, because that's what God has prepared for them to do. Equally important are the ones who put in the hard work to disciple and intentionally parent their children, because that's what God has prepared for them to do. Equally important are the ones who look to have gospel-focused conversations with their coworkers, or the ones that God calls on to teach the next generation on Sunday mornings. Equally important are the ones who strive to be the best employees that they can be, so that they can open doors to gospel conversations, because that's what God has prepared for them to do. Equally important are the ones who support the deployed by praying faithfully for them. Equally important are the ones that try to find a common interest group with the intention of making some spiritual connections and building some relationships. Whatever it is, know that God has created you for it. He equipped you for it. And He's handpicked the task specifically for you. And that's where we get our importance from. And if you're feeling cautious about what God has, whether you've got what it takes, and you're in need of strength and endurance, because even though God did pick it for us, it doesn't mean it's going to be easy. Remember the confidence that God gave to Joshua as he too looked to the future. And God said to him, "Haven't I commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or discouraged. For I, the Lord your God, is with you wherever you go."